In the early 12th century, the dusty roads of the Holy Land whispered tales of peril and devotion. Pilgrims, poor, noble, old, or young, walked these sacred paths with trembling hearts, clutching their rosaries and praying for safe passage. They did not fear the sun or the sand, but the swords of bandits who saw them as prey. Jerusalem, reclaimed from Muslim control during the First Crusade, stood at the heart of these pilgrimages. But peace was a dream. The holy roads were bathed in blood. Amid this chaos, in the year 1119, a French knight named Hugues de Payens stepped forward with a revolutionary idea. He and 8 other warriors approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal unlike any the world had ever seen: to form a religious military order, warrior monks, dedicated not to conquest but to protection. Their mission: defend Christian pilgrims as they journeyed to the holy sites of Jerusalem. Baldwin, recognizing the audacity and necessity of their vision, granted them quarters in a section of his royal palace on the Temple Mount, once believed to be the site of King Solomon's legendary temple. The symbolism was striking. These new knights would be protectors of a sacred legacy, defenders of the ancient house of God. They named themselves humbly the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar. Though they had no riches, no armies, and no banners, the Templars embodied something far more powerful: purpose. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They shared horses, slept in stone quarters, and lived with the humility of monks. Yet these were no cloistered ascetics. They were seasoned warriors who had once fought in the deserts of the First Crusade. Now they fought not for glory but for God. The roads from the coastal city of Jaffa to Jerusalem were notorious. Thieves lurked in the shadows, and ambushes were common. Caravans of pilgrims often found themselves robbed, beaten, or murdered. The presence of the Templars on these routes changed everything. Clad in simple white mantles, they rode in silence, weapons at their side, guarding the helpless. They became living shields between faith and death. As word of their bravery spread, pilgrims spoke of them in reverent tones. Stories emerged of knights who rode into danger without hesitation, who never demanded payment, and who held to their vows with unwavering devotion. They were not just guardians, they were living proof that holiness could wear armor. Yet not all saw them kindly. In a world where monks were supposed to retreat from the world, the idea of armed religious men was a contradiction. Bishops and nobles questioned the legitimacy of these fighting monks. Could a man shed blood and still be a servant of Christ? Were they holy defenders or heretics in disguise? Despite skepticism, their reputation grew. Their home on the Temple Mount stirred imaginations. Rumors began to swirl. Whispers of hidden relics, secret tunnels, and sacred knowledge buried beneath Solomon's temple. The Templars, once poor in coin, became rich in mystery. Back in Europe, their name began to echo in the courts of kings and the sermons of preachers. The idea of a divinely sanctioned knighthood resonated in a world desperate for order amid holy war. Young nobles, second sons without inheritance, saw the Templars as a path to eternal glory. Parents sent their children to serve. Landowners donated estates. The order's roots, once shallow, now reached deep into the soil of Christendom. Their emblem, the red cross on white, came to symbolize purity and sacrifice. Not a sword dripping in conquest, but a symbol of holy burden. A knight bearing it vowed not to retreat unless outnumbered 3-1. In battle, they were steadfast. In prayer, they were serene. In death, they became martyrs. But in those early years, before the myths and the riches, before the vaults in Paris and the castles in Acre, the Templars were just 9 men who dared to imagine a world where the sword could serve the spirit. They lived simply, rode boldly, and prayed in silence. They had no prophecy of what was to come. They organized their patrols with military precision. Pilgrim groups were arranged into protected convoys, with Templar knights riding at the front and rear. They moved like shadows, calm, disciplined, and alert. Bandits who once struck with impunity now faced men who neither fled nor feared. And yet, even among themselves, the Templars struggled with identity. Were they warriors pretending to be monks, or monks who had never truly left the battlefield? The line blurred, but they embraced the contradiction. Their discipline was born not from fear of death, but from faith in divine mission. When they returned to their barracks on the Temple Mount, they prayed beneath ancient stone arches. They fasted. They confessed. They bound wounds by firelight and whispered psalms beneath their breath. Every scar was a sermon, every battle a liturgy. The public began to romanticize them, but their life was harsh. Hunger, fatigue, and the constant specter of death haunted their every day. Yet they endured, because for them, salvation was not found in cloisters but in action. To them, defending the innocent was a form of worship. The silence of the Templar chapels was only broken by the creaking of armor and the prayers of men too tired to kneel. They did not seek sainthood. They did not ask for songs. They stood at the gates of the holy city not as heroes, but as sentinels. A new kind of knight had entered history, one that did not fit into the feudal molds of kings and vassals. The Templars answered only to the Pope. They transcended borders. They became an idea, an institution birthed in battle, tempered by faith, and driven by a singular purpose. The legacy of those early years, the bravery, the contradictions, the spiritual fire, would define the Templar order for generations. Before the politics and the betrayals, before the downfall and the legends, there was this: 9 men, a desert, and a dream of holy protection. The echoes of that dream still resound through history. It began not with conquest, but with compassion. Not with crowns, but with crosses. The Knights Templar, forged in the fires of Crusade, would soon rise to become the most feared and revered brotherhood the world had ever known. Before the Knights Templar emerged as guardians of pilgrims and warriors of the cross, Europe itself was teetering on the edge of transformation. The continent, still reeling from centuries of barbarian invasions, plagues, and fractured kingdoms, had begun to consolidate under a fragile tapestry of faith and feudalism. Yet under the surface, old certainties were breaking, and a new, dangerous energy was building. At the heart of medieval society lay feudalism, a rigid structure of power that bound kings, nobles, vassals, and peasants into a system of mutual obligations. Land was wealth, service was currency, and loyalty was often paid in blood. Lords ruled their manors like miniature kingdoms, and monarchs, though crowned, were often powerless against their own rebellious nobles. But where politics faltered, the Church triumphed. The Catholic Church stood as the true superpower of the West. With its cathedrals towering over towns and its bishops commanding more influence than barons, it provided spiritual unity in a disjointed world. The Pope was not just a man. He was Christ's voice on earth. And by the 11th century, that voice was growing louder. Papal reforms like those from Cluny and the Gregorian Revolution had begun to assert Rome's independence from secular kings. The investiture controversy, a bitter struggle between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV, had shaken the very notion of divine kingship. In one of history's most dramatic scenes, the emperor knelt barefoot in the snow for 3 days to beg papal forgiveness. A message had been sent. The sword now bowed to the cross. While Europe turned inward, another world flourished across the Mediterranean. The Islamic caliphates, particularly the Fatimids in Egypt and the Seljuks in the east, were realms of unparalleled sophistication. Their scholars studied the stars, translated Aristotle, and advanced medicine, while much of Europe remained locked in superstition. Cities like Baghdad and Cordoba were beacons of learning and tolerance, shining cities compared to Europe's muddy, plague-ridden towns. But the balance was shifting. As the Seljuk Turks pushed westward, they shattered Byzantine forces at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, sending shockwaves across Christendom. The Eastern Roman Emperor, desperate and humiliated, turned to the west with an appeal for help, a plea that would ignite the Age of Crusades. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at Clermont and issued a thunderous call to arms. "God wills it," he proclaimed. His words set fire to the hearts of thousands. Knights took up the cross, sewing red symbols onto their cloaks, pledging to reclaim Jerusalem and wash away their sins in holy war. It was not merely a campaign, it was salvation through combat. The First Crusade, launched shortly after, was both a miracle and a massacre. Against all odds, the Crusaders captured Antioch and then, in 1099, stormed the walls of Jerusalem. What followed was a slaughter that even contemporaries found difficult to justify. Blood ran in the streets. Churches were desecrated. Muslim and Jewish citizens were butchered in the name of Christ. From this horror, a new kingdom was born, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. But it was a fragile, fractured thing. Its European conquerors ruled over a land far from home, surrounded by hostile forces, and dependent on reinforcements that rarely came. Pilgrims still journeyed there, drawn by piety and curiosity, but their paths remained perilous. The Crusaders could hold cities, but not the countryside. They were kings without roots, and it was in this landscape of fractured power, religious zeal, and looming danger that a new idea took hold. What if knights could be something more than mercenaries or lords? What if they could be bound by faith, forged in poverty, and dedicated to something greater than personal glory? This idea germinated in the heart of the Holy Land, but its roots stretched deep into European soil. The ideals of chivalry had long existed in poems and songs, but the Templars were about to make them real. They would not fight for lords, but for God. They would not guard manors, but sacred roads. They were not bound by land, but by oath. As the 12th century dawned, the spiritual atmosphere in Europe ripened for radical devotion. The Church encouraged crusading as a path to redemption. Monastic movements like the Cistercians emphasized purity, discipline, and obedience. And people, desperate for meaning in a brutal world, looked to the Holy Land as the heart of salvation. The Templars were born of this convergence. They were spiritual warriors for a spiritual age. Their emergence was not just a reaction to the dangers of pilgrimage, but to the thirst for new purpose, a calling that transcended knightly vanity and monastic seclusion. But this fusion was radical. Never before had the monastery and the battlefield merged so completely. The sword had always been a symbol of earthly power. Now it would become a tool of sacred duty. This was not just an evolution, it was a revolution. The foundations of the Templar order were not laid in ivory towers or royal courts, but on blood-soaked earth, among the cries of the dying and the prayers of the desperate. Their earliest mission, to protect the weak on sacred ground, was itself a radical reinterpretation of Christian duty. No longer would monks remain behind monastery walls. No longer would knights live for tournaments and inheritance. A new path had opened, one that led through silence, steel, and sacrifice. The roots of the revolution that created the Knights Templar were thus not found in wealth or politics, but in a yearning, an aching desire to serve something eternal. It was this yearning that would fuel their rise, shape their rules, and define their legacy for centuries to come. And so, beneath the burning sun of Jerusalem, as ancient sands whispered of prophets and kings, 9 knights knelt and made a vow that would echo across time. The age of the warrior monk had begun. The medieval world had long known warriors. It had long revered saints. but never before had the two become one. The emergence of the Knights Templar shattered the boundaries of medieval identity. For the first time, the sword and the psalter were wielded by the same hand. The knight became the monk. The monk became the warrior. To a feudal Europe accustomed to strict roles, kings who ruled, clergy who prayed, and knights who fought, the Templar order was a shock to the system. Their existence posed a question that had no precedent. Could a man serve God while taking lives? Could violence be sanctified? For the Templars, the answer was yes, but only under the strictest of conditions. Every strike of the sword, every drop of blood spilled, had to serve divine justice. This was not war for conquest, but a sacrificial offering, combat as penance, battle as prayer. And to live such a contradiction required discipline beyond comprehension. Their daily lives began in silence. Long before dawn, the Templars rose to chant the canonical hours. Even on campaign, surrounded by blood and chaos, they would kneel beside their horses to pray. The armor they wore was not just forged of metal, it was wrapped in faith. It weighed heavy not just on their shoulders, but on their souls. Their vows were more severe than any secular knight would tolerate. Chastity meant total renunciation of intimacy. Even a kiss from a mother or sister was forbidden. Poverty meant that all possessions were surrendered to the order. They owned nothing, not even the weapons they carried or the food they ate. Obedience, the most sacred vow, demanded instant submission to commands, even if it meant death. Such rigidity created men of steel, both in flesh and spirit. They were molded into instruments, singular in purpose, absolute in loyalty. A Templar knight could not retreat from battle unless outnumbered at least 3-1. To turn from a fight prematurely was not cowardice, it was heresy. Yet their hearts were not hardened brutes. Many were deeply contemplative. Between military drills and defensive patrols, they recited psalms, fasted, and practiced self-denial. They lived under constant spiritual scrutiny. Every thought was judged, every action weighed. In this crucible of warfare and worship, only the most dedicated endured. Their training was relentless. Unlike feudal levies, who often fought with little coordination, the Templars drilled endlessly. Swordplay, horsemanship, and formation discipline became second nature. They moved in unison, charging like thunder, retreating like shadow. In combat, they were poetry in motion, precise, fearless, unstoppable. Their white mantles, stark and solemn, bore a red cross sewn over the heart. It was no decorative flourish, it was a badge of martyrdom. It declared their readiness to die in service of Christ. Enemies feared the sight of it. Allies found hope in its presence. It marked the battlefield like a divine standard. But their martial excellence was more than brute strength. It was strategy. They studied their foes, Muslim horse archers, ambush tactics, desert maneuvers, and adapted. They employed reconnaissance, maintained supply chains, and fortified mountain passes. They were knights, yes, but they were also engineers, logisticians, and tacticians. Still, the world struggled to understand them. Bishops questioned the purity of warriors who killed. Monarchs resented their independence. Yet their victories silenced doubts. When a fortress held, it was because Templars manned its walls. When a caravan reached Jerusalem safely, it was because Templars rode at its flank. Behind every shield was a man, scarred by war, sanctified by purpose. Some were noble-born sons who had forsaken luxury. Others were seasoned crusaders seeking redemption. All were equals under the Templar rule. They ate the same gruel, bore the same burdens, and marched under the same sun. Inside the order, hierarchy existed, but not privilege. The Grand Master held supreme authority, yet he too washed his garments and prayed among his men. Leadership was earned not through bloodline, but through devotion and battlefield excellence. Theirs was a meritocracy bound by divine command. And yet, for all their strength, they did not revel in violence. The rule forbade arrogance. Templars could not boast, gamble, or hunt for sport. They were not warriors in search of glory, but servants defending sacred ground. Even their victories were met with humility. Their triumphs, they believed, belonged to God alone. In a world of splendor and sin, the Templars stood apart. They did not seek wealth, though it came. They did not seek fame, though it followed. They sought only to protect and to pray. Their swords were not drawn for kings, but for Christ. And in that devotion, they became something never seen before, the embodiment of a paradox. In them, the medieval world saw a new possibility, of holiness that bled, of courage that knelt, of warriors who confessed before battle and wept after victory. The legacy of the Templar fusion, monk and knight, steel and scripture, would redefine the very notion of Christian knighthood. They were not simply defenders of a city. They were guardians of an idea. In the fires of faith, they forged a new model of knighthood, one that would endure long after the battles ceased, echoing across centuries in both reverence and fear. No great order survives without a foundation. And for the Knights Templar, that foundation was not forged in steel, but in scripture, sacrifice, and a set of rules unlike any that came before. The regula pauperum commilitonem Christi Templique Salomonaci, the rule of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, was more than just a guideline. It was a sacred covenant, crafted under the watchful eye of Bernard of Clairvaux, abbot, theologian, and spiritual luminary of the 12th century. The rule codified the soul of the Templar order. Drawing inspiration from the Benedictine and Cistercian monastic traditions, Bernard created something entirely new. A blueprint for warrior monks, a doctrine where prayer and warfare coexisted without contradiction. At the heart of the rule was discipline, rigid, unwavering, total. Every aspect of a Templar's life was regulated. From how many hours they prayed to how much meat they consumed, from how long their hair could grow to how they held the reins of their horses. It left no room for ego, indulgence, or weakness. Daily life began in darkness. Long before sunrise, the Templars gathered for prayer. The chapel echoed not with chants of triumph, but with humble voices asking for strength and forgiveness. They bowed before crucifixes, not kings. Even in the heat of campaign, when blood still stained their swords, they knelt in dusty circles and whispered psalms beneath the stars. Meals were eaten in silence, with scripture being read aloud, reminding even the mightiest knight that he was but dust before God. Meat was allowed only on certain days. Wine, if permitted at all, was to be consumed without pleasure. Everything they did, from dining to dying, was meant to strip away pride and cultivate obedience. And obedience was the golden law. The rule demanded absolute submission to authority. Orders were to be followed without hesitation, without question. On the battlefield, this meant the difference between victory and ruin. In the monastery, it meant the difference between sanctity and sin. Templars could not touch gold or silver without permission. They owned no property. Upon joining the order, every new recruit surrendered his titles, lands, and wealth to the brotherhood. From that moment onward, he became part of a collective soul. The individual was erased. Only the mission remained. Even appearance was policed. Hair had to be trimmed regularly. Beards were to be full but neat. Clothes were plain, functional, and uniform. No flashy armor, no personalized shields. Their identity was bound to the red cross stitched over their hearts, silent, blood-colored, eternal. Perhaps most startling were the rules surrounding women. The Templars were forbidden not just from marriage, but from even touching women, including family. A mother's embrace, a sister's farewell kiss, These two were considered distractions from divine purpose. Temptation, they believed, was the crack through which evil crept. When rules were broken, punishment was swift. Lesser violations earned fasting or flogging. More serious ones, such as theft, disobedience, or moral failings, could result in expulsion. A Templar who was cast out did not simply lose rank. He lost his identity, his brothers, and his spiritual standing. It was a living death. The rule also dictated conduct in battle. Templars were never to flee unless outnumbered 3-1. Cowardice was a sin. They were to fight in formation, protect the weak, and never pursue personal glory. Their goal was not conquest, it was defense. Their strength came from unity and their faith from sacrifice. Yet, amid all this rigidity, the rule carried a quiet wisdom. It allowed for adaptation. In times of war, when routines crumbled and rituals faltered, brothers were instructed to pray inwardly, to recite the Lord's Prayer if they could not reach the chapel. Even in chaos, the flame of devotion had to be kept alive. The hierarchy within the order was strict but functional. At the apex stood the Grand Master, a man both spiritual father and military commander. Beneath him were the seneschals, marshals, drapers, and treasurers. Each had defined duties. Each answered to the whole. No one was above the rule. And yet, despite the structure, the spirit of fraternity was strong. Knights, sergeants, chaplains, and servants all dined together. They prayed together. They bled together. Though ranks existed, the shared burden of divine service fostered unity, a bond stronger than steel. This unique fusion of monasticism and militarism was unprecedented. In a world where monks withdrew from violence and knights indulged in it, the Templars carved a third path, one of sacred warfare, where purity and peril walked hand in hand. The rule became their spine, their scripture, their silent code. It transformed them from men into a movement, and as it spread from Jerusalem to Paris, from Acre to London, it turned 9 poor knights into the guardians of a faith that reached across continents. Other military orders would arise, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, but none would match the Templars' blend of spiritual austerity and martial precision. They were the blueprint, the prototype, the warrior monks who changed the way Christendom thought about service, suffering, and sanctity. In time, the rule would face challenges, corruption, politics, betrayal. But in these early years, it stood as a testament to the impossible dream that had birthed the order. That one could kill without hate, die without fear, and serve without seeking reward. It was not just a rule. It was a revolution written in parchment and blood. A map for how to be holy in an unholy world. In an age when kings ruled by divine right and the church crowned emperors, power was rarely shared, and never given freely. But the Knights Templar were not ordinary subjects. They existed outside the traditional power structure. Their loyalty did not lie with any lord or monarch. It ascended higher, past royal courts, across borders, up the long staircase of Christendom, until it reached a single throne, the Papal See in Rome. This relationship, forged in the early 12th century, changed everything. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued the papal bull Omni Datum Optimum, a document that became the Templars' shield against the encroaching hands of kings and bishops alike. It granted the order privileges unheard of in medieval Europe. They could collect tithes, build their own churches, and most importantly, they were subject only to papal authority. No bishop could command them. No king could tax them. No lord could conscript them. They were untouchable. To understand the gravity of this autonomy, one must understand the medieval world's obsession with hierarchy. Feudal society depended on chains of obligation, land in exchange for service, loyalty in exchange for protection. The Templars severed that chain. They were bound only to each other, to their rule, and to the Pope. It was both a blessing and a threat. Their growing power stirred resentment. Monarchs, already wary of papal overreach, now watched as an elite military force grew within their kingdoms, answering not to them, but to a distant pope. The Templars built commanderies across Europe, acquired vast lands, and fortified castles, all while operating outside the king's taxation system. Their independence was more than legal. It was operational. Templar messengers rode across borders without paying tolls. Their churches rang bells without episcopal approval. Their priests administered sacraments without consulting local bishops. They had become, in essence, a state within a state. But the papacy saw in them something different, an extension of its own reach. While popes struggled to enforce authority over far-flung territories, the Templars provided a solution: loyal, disciplined, militarized agents of the Church. They could carry papal decrees, protect church assets, and defend the Holy Land without entangling political agendas. This alliance between sword and crozier was mutually beneficial. The Templars gained legitimacy, wealth, and protection. The papacy gained an international army that would never rebel, never scheme for a throne, and never ask for land in return. The Templars took only what they were given, and what was given was considerable. In the Holy Land, this autonomy translated into swift, decisive action. When threats emerged, the Templars did not need to petition kings or seek noble approval. They moved, they acted, and they often succeeded where fragmented feudal armies failed. Their discipline, rooted in the rule, was now empowered by the freedom to operate across kingdoms without interference. Europe soon took notice. Nobles began to donate estates not just out of piety but pragmatism. Supporting the Templars meant currying favor with Rome. It meant absolution, indulgence, and spiritual prestige. Monasteries might pray for your soul, but the Templars would fight for it. With every land grant and papal endorsement, their network expanded. They built fortresses in Spain to fight the Moors, outposts in France to house recruits, and ports in England to receive supplies. Their commanderies became not just military hubs, but centers of diplomacy, finance, and administration. Yet this growth deepened the chasm between them and secular rulers. Kings began to whisper, "How much land do they own? How many men do they command? Why do they not kneel?" The Templars remained outwardly humble. They lived under vows. They wore plain clothes, but their independence made them dangerously unique. They were everywhere and nowhere. They were respected and feared, and yet, in the eyes of the Church, they remained pure. Their red cross was not stained with ambition. Their swords were drawn in God's name. They embodied the ideal of Militia Christi, the army of Christ. This divine endorsement, however, came at a cost. By aligning so closely with the papacy, they made themselves enemies of its enemies. As the Church's fortunes rose and fell, so too did the safety of the Templars. Their survival was tethered to the health of a single institution. Still, during the height of their power, they wielded a kind of mobility that no other order could match. They crossed borders with impunity, brokered peace between warring kings, and stored the treasures of Europe's most powerful houses in their fortified vaults. Their trustworthiness was unquestioned. Their autonomy, sacred. It was a fragile balance, one held aloft by discipline, reputation, and faith. But the higher they rose, the more precarious their position became. For in a world of jealous kings and ambitious prelates, no sword is sharp enough to cut free from suspicion forever. The alliance between the Templars and the papacy had made them legends, but it also made them targets. The very privileges that allowed them to serve the Church would one day be used as accusations of heresy, arrogance, and treason. Yet in this moment, in the era of Innocent II and Bernard of Clairvaux, they were untouchable. They were warriors of the Church, answerable to no crown, defending Christendom from the infidel and the faithless alike. And so, as monarchs plotted, as bishops grumbled, the Templars marched. Across deserts, mountains, and seas, their swords glinted in the sun. Their crosses shone in blood. They rode not for kings, but for the Pope. Not for land, but for the Lord. While the knights themselves were symbols of Christian devotion and martial excellence, the true monuments to the Templars' power were not carved in scripture, but in stone. Towering walls, iron-bound gates, and battlements that kissed the clouds. These were the enduring signatures of the order. Castles not only fortified the frontier of Christendom, they declared to every enemy, "Here stands the unshakable faith of the Templars." Templar fortresses were more than military installations. They were cathedrals of defense, designed with religious intention and built with brutal functionality. Rising in the deserts of Syria, nestled in the hills of Spain, or guarding the coasts of the Mediterranean, each was tailored to its landscape and mission. Their most iconic stronghold, Croix de Chevaliers in present-day Syria, was a marvel of medieval engineering. Perched upon a strategic hill, it rose like a stone leviathan. Massive concentric walls, moats hewn from living rock, and towers arranged to pour fire on invaders from all angles. It was not just a garrison, it was a statement of dominance and permanence. These castles were often built upon older Roman, Byzantine, or Islamic ruins, reclaimed and reforged in the image of Christian resistance. Their placement was deliberate. Each guarded a trade route, a water source, or a sacred site. The Templars knew that power in the medieval world flowed along roads and rivers. Control the crossroads and you control the kingdom. The architecture reflected their spiritual discipline. Unlike the flamboyant castles of secular lords adorned with banners and crests, Templar fortresses were austere. Their stone walls bore no decoration. Their chambers were bare, their chapels plain. Every brick was laid for defense, not display. The layout of a Templar castle was a testament to order. Inner courtyards housed stables, kitchens, smithies, and cisterns, self-sustaining units designed to withstand months of siege. The knights' quarters surrounded a central chapel where prayers echoed at dawn and dusk, reminding defenders that their strength came not from battlements, but from belief. Defensive innovations were ahead of their time. Bent entrances frustrated battering rams. Murder holes allowed defenders to rain boiling oil or arrows upon intruders. Hidden passageways permitted swift movement between towers. Observation posts provided panoramic views of enemy approach. They didn't merely resist attacks, they anticipated them. Many fortresses, such as Safed and Tortosa, utilized natural terrain, mountain ridges, cliffs, and coastal bluffs to augment their defenses. This blending of stone and soil made them nearly impossible to conquer without prolonged siege, and even then, the Templars often held until the bitter end. But castles were not merely refuges. They were launching pads. From these strongholds, Templar patrols emerged to escort pilgrims, raid enemy positions, or reinforce besieged cities. They were both sword and shield, protecting the faithful and striking fear into the hearts of infidels. The construction of these fortresses required tremendous resources and skill. Local labor was often employed, along with Templar engineers trained in both Western and Eastern architectural traditions. Some methods were learned from Muslim builders, whose mastery of stonework was legendary. The Templars, pragmatic as always, adopted what worked regardless of origin. While the Holy Land remains their most famous domain, the Order's fortifications extended across Europe. In Portugal, Tomar Castle stood as a beacon of Templar resilience during the Reconquista. Its round towers and central keep housed both warriors and sacred relics. In England and France, Templar preceptories doubled as administrative centers and safe havens for travelers. These European holdings served another purpose: funding. Farmlands surrounding castles fed their garrisons and produced surplus for trade. Templar estates became economic engines, supporting the costly operations in the east. Every fortress in France or Aragon echoed with the rhythm of hammers and hooves, sustaining the flame that burned in distant Jerusalem. Inside their walls, life was Spartan. Meals were taken in silence, interrupted only by scripture. Black-robed sergeants cooked, cleaned, and repaired weapons. Chaplains offered confession and mass. Training was constant: archery, swordplay, horsemanship. The fortress was not a place of rest. It was a monastery under arms. These sanctuaries of stone also served as vaults. Kings entrusted the Templars with gold, jewels, and documents. Their castles were safer than any treasury, watched over by men who feared God more than death. In some regions, the fortress treasury rivaled the wealth of the crown itself. But the castles also carried a burden. To hold them was to bear the weight of expectation. If a Templar garrison faltered, if a banner fell, it was not merely a strategic loss, it was a spiritual wound. Their walls bore witness to final stands, desperate retreats, and blood spilled in the name of faith. And still they endured. Crusades came and went. Monarchs rose and fell. But the castles stood silent, steadfast, sacred. They were more than architecture. They were manifestations of will, willed into existence by a brotherhood that believed defense of the faith required more than prayers. In the end, these fortresses would become tombs for many. Trapped during sieges, cut off from retreat, the Templars often chose death over surrender. Their ruins today, weathered by time and wind, speak not of defeat, but of devotion carved in stone. The fortress, for the Templars, was not just a bastion, it was a creed. Every wall built, every gate locked, every stone blessed with prayer. These were acts of worship. To defend the faith was to dwell within it. Their castles were not just homes of war, but sanctuaries of conviction. The Templars began as guardians of the road, armed escorts for barefoot pilgrims treading the perilous paths to the Holy Sepulchre. But history has little patience for simplicity. The needs of Christendom grew, and with it, so too did the order's role. In less than a generation, the Templars transformed from humble protectors to strategic powers, shaping the very landscape of the Crusader kingdoms. As the Crusader states matured, Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch, and Edessa, they became fractured, fragile mosaics of European idealism planted in foreign soil. These Latin states were under constant threat. Muslim forces pressed on their borders. Internal feuds among lords destabilized leadership. Reinforcements from Europe were sporadic and unreliable. The Templars stepped into this void, not as conquerors but as stabilizers. Their reputation for discipline and incorruptibility made them natural candidates to hold frontier forts, lead battle formations, and advise monarchs. They were not political in ambition, but their neutrality gave them immense political leverage. Everyone needed them. No one truly controlled them. Their first military expansion beyond pilgrim protection came with the building and manning of isolated castles on hostile borders. These outposts were not grand like Croix de Chevaliers, but they were critical. Small keeps overlooking mountain passes, guarding river crossings, and watching caravan routes through the desert. The Templars didn't just hold ground. They made ground safe. Kings soon noticed. Baldwin II of Jerusalem entrusted them with key fortresses. The Count of Tripoli granted them lands. The Prince of Antioch sought their aid. It wasn't long before the Templars held more fortified positions in Outremer than any single noble family. From their growing network of strongholds, the order began to shape Crusader policy. Their messengers relayed intelligence. Their knights offered military advice. Their treasure helped fund campaigns. A Templar presence at a royal council was as common as a bishop's, and often just as influential. But their influence wasn't confined to court. On the battlefield, their prowess became legendary. At the Battle of Montcassard in 1177, a small force of Crusaders faced the massive army of Saladin. Heavily outnumbered and near despair, they turned to the Templars. With calm precision, the knights formed a vanguard, plunging into enemy ranks and disrupting Saladin's advance. Their bravery helped snatch victory from the jaws of annihilation. The order's spiritual character gave them a strange invincibility. Templars did not fear death. They welcomed it if it came in service of God. That fearlessness translated into ferocity on the field. Enemy forces knew that a Templar line did not break. When they charged, it was with silent, solemn certainty. Yet their rise brought challenges. The more power they held, the more they became entangled in the politics they once avoided. Factions within Crusader courts began to view them as obstacles. Some resented their papal immunity. Others feared their autonomy. The Templars, bound by rule, could not bow to secular whims, and this made them both indispensable and infuriating. In the countryside, they administered lands like feudal lords, collecting taxes, managing crops, overseeing justice. Their estates were more efficient and better defended than many noble holdings. Pilgrims, too, increasingly relied on their networks. The Templars became more than protectors. They were providers, governors, builders of infrastructure. Their religious neutrality also made them useful in diplomacy. While kings feuded and nobles schemed, Templar representatives served as go-betweens, trusted by all sides, because their mission was never self-serving. Their allegiance was to Christendom, not crowns. In Muslim territories, they negotiated prisoner exchanges and ceasefires. While their role in combat was ruthless, their role in diplomacy was surprisingly pragmatic. They respected honor-bound enemies. When treaties were made, the Templars upheld them, sometimes against the wishes of less scrupulous allies. The very roads they once patrolled for pilgrims now became arteries of commerce and diplomacy. Through Templar oversight, trade flourished. Markets near their castles prospered. Caravans moved more freely. With security came stability, and with stability, prosperity. Still, their loyalty to the Church never wavered. Papal envoys were treated with deference. Ecclesiastical disputes were brought before their chaplains. Donations from Europe flowed steadily, and the Templars used them with purpose. Supplies were funneled to besieged outposts. Ransoms were paid for captured knights. Relief fleets arrived at ports the Templars controlled. Internally, the order remained remarkably unified. Despite their expansion, they avoided the factionalism that plagued other Crusader institutions. The rule bound them. Their training shaped them. Their vow of obedience forged unity where others had discord. Yet this consolidation of power was not without consequences. Their critics began to accuse them of arrogance. Whispers of secrecy turned into rumors. Their private rituals, impenetrable command structure, and papal exemption fed speculation. To outsiders, they seemed like a kingdom within a kingdom, a brotherhood above reproach. Nevertheless, they continued their mission. In a land of shifting sands and unstable thrones, the Templars remained constant. Their white mantles flickered across the horizon, symbols of order in a world of chaos. From their humble origins protecting pilgrims, they had become the scaffolding upon which the Crusader states depended. Wherever Christendom was most fragile, the Templars stood firm. They were no longer just knights. They were the architects of security, the builders of borders, the bridge between faith and force. And in that transformation, they secured not only territory but a legacy. For decades, the Knights Templar stood as paragons of unity, devoted, incorruptible, and obedient to God above all. But even the strongest walls can begin to crack. As their influence expanded across Christendom and the Holy Land, so too did the complexities of their alliances, the depth of their rivalries, and the bitterness of suspicion that would one day consume them. The first signs of friction came not from their enemies, but their brothers in arms. The Hospitallers, another military order born from the crusading fire, had originally focused on medical care, tending to sick and wounded pilgrims. But as war became the language of the Levant, they too raised swords. What had once been complementary missions slowly evolved into quiet competition. At first, their cooperation was seamless. Both protected Christian interests, garrisoned fortresses, and fought shoulder to shoulder in battles. But as donations poured in and noble families had to choose where to pledge their gold and sons, comparison gave way to rivalry. The Hospitallers were seen as the more charitable, the Templars the more militant. Supporters split along lines of ideology and ambition. Tensions deepened as both orders sought control over strategic strongholds and political influence. In some regions, they clashed over land rights. In others, disputes over command led to standoffs that required papal mediation. The rivalry remained professional until it wasn't. Far from the Holy Land, kings and nobles exploited the tension. Rulers who distrusted the Templars often backed the Hospitallers, and vice versa. The orders were used like pawns in larger political games, their reputations manipulated, their motives questioned. Worse still, the internal politics of the Crusader states became a quagmire. In Outremer, European-born Crusaders often looked down on second-generation settlers, the Polains, Franks born in the East. These locals had adapted to Levantine life, adopting customs, speaking Arabic, and even negotiating with Muslim leaders when prudent. To many Templars, such accommodation smacked of weakness. They favored hardline policies, fortress over diplomacy, sword over negotiation. But to the Polains, this rigidity threatened the delicate balance they had built with their neighbors. Peace, however temporary, was sometimes preferable to war. These ideological divides grew sharper. Kings like Amalric of Jerusalem and later Guy of Lusignan often found themselves caught between appeasing the orders and governing fractured nobility. Some monarchs relied on Templar might to assert royal authority. Others resented their independence and papal immunity, seeing them as an unchecked power operating within their borders. As Crusader states weakened and territories shrank under Muslim pressure, blame began to circulate like a plague. When battles were lost, who was at fault? The generals? The kings? Or the powerful orders who claimed divine mission yet wielded earthly power? The fall of the county of Edessa in 1144, the first major Crusader stronghold to be lost, shocked Christendom. Panic spread, and the Second Crusade was launched in response. Yet when it too faltered, whispers grew louder. The orders, especially the Templars, had become too powerful, too rich, too secretive. It was not only outsiders who began to question. Within the order, maintaining spiritual discipline amid growing political entanglements became increasingly difficult. New recruits came not only for devotion, but for prestige. Some brought pride with them, ambition veiled in the Red Cross. The Grand Masters walked a narrow path, juggling loyalty to the Pope, service to the Holy Land, and relations with monarchs across Europe. One misstep could unravel decades of trust. Some Grand Masters, like Bertrand de Blanchefort, were diplomats. Others, like Gerard de Ridefort, were warriors whose zeal sometimes blinded them to the greater strategic picture. Ridefort, in particular, became a symbol of rising tensions. His decision to launch an ill-fated charge at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, against counsel and with reckless enthusiasm, contributed to one of the greatest catastrophes in Crusader history. The Christian armies were annihilated. The true cross was captured. And Jerusalem, sacred Jerusalem, was lost to Saladin. That loss broke something in the Crusader spirit. It shattered illusions of divine invincibility. It also placed immense pressure on the Templars and their counterparts. From then on, every defeat brought scrutiny. Every decision was judged not only by military merit but by political expediency. As Muslim powers regained ground, the Christian kingdoms of the East grew desperate. Diplomacy with former enemies became a necessity. Yet the Templars, bound by oath and a legacy of sacrifice, struggled to accept compromise. Their idealism, once their strength, now became a liability in a world that demanded nuance. Even among allies, cracks formed. Crusaders from Western Europe, arriving in the East with fanatical zeal, often distrusted the locals, Templars included. They accused them of being too Eastern, too comfortable, even secretly aligned with Muslim emirs. These accusations were baseless, but they festered. Meanwhile, rumors about the Templars' secret rituals, strange initiations, and immense hidden wealth gained momentum. Their closed ranks and silent obedience, once admired, now invited suspicion. What was hidden behind those castle walls? What oaths were taken behind closed doors? By the dawn of the 13th century, the order found itself under siege, not just by the enemies of Christendom, but by those it had once protected. Kings needed their gold but resented their autonomy. Popes relied on their loyalty but feared their influence. And the common people, those who once prayed for Templar protection, began to tell darker stories. The storm clouds gathered slowly, but unmistakably. What had begun as murmurs would one day erupt into accusations. Heresy, idolatry, betrayal. But not yet. For now, the Templars still stood tall, revered, feared, and needed. Their banners still flew from castle towers. Their knights still knelt in silent prayer. But beneath the surface, the ground was shifting. The greatest threat to the Templars was no longer the sword of the Saracen. It was the knife behind their own backs. Long before the printing press or the birth of modern capitalism, there existed a network of power so vast, so efficient, and so mysterious that even kings came to kneel before it. Not in prayer, but in debt. This network did not belong to merchants or monarchs. It belonged to monks, warriors, knights, the Templars. While the public saw them as defenders of the faith, beneath their white mantles and fortress walls, the Templars had quietly built something extraordinary, a financial empire. By the late 12th and early 13th centuries, they had become the safest, most trusted institution for handling vast sums of money. And it all began with a simple need: security. Pilgrims to the Holy Land often carried coin, offerings, savings, or funds for their journey. Roads swarmed with bandits. Deserts offered no mercy. And local lords were not always trustworthy. The Templars stepped in with a solution. Deposit your funds at a Templar preceptory in Europe and withdraw the equivalent amount in Jerusalem. A revolutionary concept, one that foreshadowed the modern banking system. This innovation was more than a convenience. It was a lifeline. Nobles, merchants, and even kings began entrusting the Templars with their fortunes. Templar commanderies throughout Europe became banks in all but name, guarding assets, managing estates, offering loans, and even issuing letters of credit that could be redeemed across borders. Their financial power exploded. With their papal protection and tax exemption, they could move money without interference. Their loyalty to no crown made them neutral in conflicts. And their ironclad reputation for honesty made them preferable to any secular banker. In France, England, Aragon, and beyond, the order acquired vineyards, mills, ports, farms, and entire towns, not through conquest, but through donation, purchase, and investment. These holdings produced income that funded their military efforts abroad. Their network was vast, interconnected, and above all, efficient. Their Paris temple, located near what is now the Molay district, became a central hub of this financial engine. Enclosed within stone walls were not just barracks, but treasure chambers, vaults that held the wealth of the most powerful men in Europe. Kings would ride there in secret, cloaked and hooded, to request loans or safeguard state funds. It is said that during times of war, monarchs like England's Henry III turned to the Templars to store the crown jewels, fearing theft or political betrayal from their own nobles. And when kings needed coin to wage crusades or to suppress revolts, they often borrowed from the order at favorable terms. But money, as it always does, bred envy. Whispers of Templar gold began to outshine tales of their battlefield bravery. The order's refusal to flaunt its riches only deepened the mystique. What treasures lay hidden in their temples? Were they hoarding relics, sacred scrolls, secrets of the ancients? The legend of the Templar treasure was born, not in fact, but in shadow. Some claimed they had recovered Solomon's riches beneath the ruins of his temple in Jerusalem. Others whispered of golden idols, arcane artifacts, and forbidden knowledge hoarded away from the eyes of the church. None of this was confirmed, but secrecy breeds suspicion, and the Templars, by the very nature of their vows, offered few answers. Despite their monastic code, they became landlords to thousands, creditors to kings, and overseers of economies. Their strict internal accounting, secrecy, and centralized command allowed them to outmaneuver the guilds and bankers of their time. They operated like an invisible hand behind the thrones of Europe, never interfering, but always present. This financial dominance made them both indispensable and dangerous. While they never abused their power, never sought to topple rulers or stir revolts, the mere fact that they could if they wished was enough to stoke fear. Rulers like King Philip IV of France, increasingly indebted and politically isolated, began to view the Templars not as allies of God, but as pawns to be sacrificed. Their wealth, if seized, could fund wars. Their downfall, if justified, could be framed as a holy act. And so, what began as practical stewardship of pilgrim coin had grown into a towering temple of gold, one that cast a long and ominous shadow over the Christian world. But the Templars did not see the trap being laid. Their financial operations continued unabated. They built more preceptories, hired more scribes, perfected their systems. They believed, perhaps naively, that their sacred mission protected them from the tides of politics. They were wrong, for in the hearts of men, gold glitters more seductively than faith. And the very wealth the Templars had acquired to protect Christendom would one day be used to condemn them. The sword may have built their reputation, but gold had become their vulnerability. And in a world ruled by kings and papal decrees, power without protection is a dangerous thing. By the turn of the 13th century, the dream that had once galvanized Christendom, the dream of a united Christian dominion in the Holy Land, was withering. What had begun as righteous conquest under banners of salvation had decayed into politics, betrayal, and exhaustion. The Crusader states, once flickering beacons of hope in the East, were now fractured, vulnerable, and surrounded. The age of glory was ending, and with it the purpose for which the Templars had been born. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187 was more than a military defeat. It was a spiritual wound. The city that had defined the Templars' sacred mission now belonged to Saladin. The Christian world reeled. The response was swift. The Third Crusade, led by kings like Richard the Lionheart, marched east to reclaim the Holy City. They achieved victories. They restored Christian access to pilgrimage sites. but they failed to retake Jerusalem, and that failure echoed. Crusades continued 4th, 5th, 6th, but each brought diminishing returns. The warriors of Europe came not as saints, but as opportunists. Crusading fever had faded into political calculus, and the enemies they faced, united under Muslim leaders like Saladin and later the Mamluks, were more organized and more ruthless than ever. The Templars remained. While others returned home or abandoned hope, the Templars dug in. They fortified coastal strongholds like Acre, Sidon, and Tortosa. They trained new recruits, upheld their rule, and continued to bleed for a cause that fewer and fewer seemed to believe in. Their military discipline never faltered, but their numbers thinned. Supplies grew scarce. Reinforcements came too slowly, and when they came, they were often led by men who had never set foot in the desert. The Crusader states became like islands in a rising sea of hostility. In 1291, the sea swallowed the land. The fall of Acre marked the death knell of Christian power in the Levant. Once a bustling port and the beating heart of the Crusader presence, Acre was besieged by the Mamluks under Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil. The Templars, along with the Hospitallers and a few remaining Frankish knights, made a valiant last stand. From the towers of their citadel, they rained arrows and boiling pitch on the attackers. They fought street by street, house by house. But it was not enough. As the city burned and its walls crumbled, the Templars held out in their sea-facing fortress for days. When finally breached, they detonated their own stronghold, collapsing it in a fiery blaze and burying themselves and their enemies beneath stone and smoke. It was a fitting epitaph, death before surrender. Acre's fall marked the end of the Templars' presence in the Holy Land. From the ashes, the survivors sailed to Cyprus, the last Christian bastion in the east. There, they regrouped, but something fundamental had changed. They were now knights without a battlefield, warriors without a war. And yet, the order refused to die. Plans were drawn. Hopes of launching a new crusade flickered. Cyprus became a staging ground. Castles were reinforced. Ships were built. Templar diplomats petitioned European monarchs for aid. The Pope was urged to unite the kingdoms for one final, decisive blow. But Europe had moved on. The Mongols threatened the East. Internal wars racked the continent. Trade with the Islamic world was more profitable than war. The idea of another crusade became a relic, mentioned in sermons but never pursued. The Templars waited, but the call never came. Still they trained. Still they prayed. Still they wore the red cross over their hearts. Their vow had not expired, even if the world had grown deaf to it. And so the Templars adapted. They shifted focus to protecting Christian shipping routes. They fortified positions in Cyprus and Rhodes. Some members were dispatched to Spain to aid in the Reconquista. Others returned to France and England, taking up roles as financiers, landowners, and administrators. But without their defining purpose, defending the Holy Land, the Templars began to look different. No longer martyrs on distant battlefields, they were now powerful men in powerful places. Castles without enemies, vaults filled with gold. Their military mission had been holy, but their survival made them vulnerable. Kings began to wonder, why should the Templars persist? Now that their crusade is over, why should they possess more wealth than barons? Why do they answer only to Rome? The fall of Acre did not destroy the Templars, but it left them exposed. Without a sacred battleground, the Red Cross cast longer shadows. The same discipline that had earned them reverence now bred suspicion. Their secrecy became their curse. And so, as they rebuilt in Cyprus and waited for a new call to arms, dark winds stirred in Europe. New enemies were rising, not with scimitars and siege towers, but with ink, whispers, and royal seals. The last crusade had ended, but the final battle had not yet begun. It would not be fought in the deserts of Syria. It would be fought in the courts of kings. The Templars had survived the fall of Acre, the collapse of the Crusader states, and centuries of bloodshed in the Holy Land. They had endured battle, famine, and betrayal. But now, in the early years of the 14th century, their greatest enemy was not a foreign army. It was the King of France. Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair, was a monarch cloaked in majesty and ambition. Beneath his pale, solemn face lay a mind hardened by debt and a will sharpened by desperation. His wars against England and Flanders had emptied his coffers. His conflict with the papacy had alienated the Church, and his people, burdened by taxes and unrest, began to grumble. The Templars, with their untaxed wealth, independent network, and international prestige, were both a temptation and a threat. For years, Philip had borrowed heavily from the Templars, funding campaigns, securing supplies, and even entrusting them with his royal treasury. But what began as dependence turned into resentment. He owed them more than coin, he owed them power. And power, to Philip, was a debt that could not go unpaid. In public, he praised them. In private, he plotted. The Templars' rigid hierarchy and internal secrecy made them ideal targets for fabrication. Whispers became tools. Innuendo became weapon. Philip's agents began gathering testimony, through coercion, torture, and bribes, of dark rituals and blasphemous oaths allegedly performed during Templar initiations. These accusations were not new. Rumors had always followed the order. That they spat on the cross, worshipped idols, engaged in indecent brotherhood. But now the king gave those rumors royal authority. He would use them to crush a threat, erase a debt, and seize unimaginable wealth. On Friday, October 13, 1307, the trap was sprung. Across France, Templar houses were stormed at dawn. Knights were dragged from their beds. Commanderies were ransacked. Chests were seized. Priors, sergeants, chaplains, all arrested under orders sealed with the fleur-de-lis. The charges were grotesque. Heresy, idol worship, sodomy, corruption. The same men who had bled for Christ were now accused of betraying him. Under torture, confessions flowed. Pain broke silence. Fear bent loyalty. Some confessed to kissing other knights on the mouth during rituals. Others swore they had denied Christ. Many retracted their words as soon as the pressure stopped. But the damage was done. The headlines had been written in agony. Pope Clement V, stunned and cornered, tried to intervene. He had no wish to see the Templars dismantled, an order he regarded as faithful, disciplined, and useful. But Philip was relentless. He summoned legal scholars, theologians, and public support. He framed the issue not as politics, but as salvation. To question the charges, he claimed, was to question the purity of the Church itself. Across Europe, monarchs hesitated. England's Edward II initially refused to arrest the Templars. Others balked at the idea of condemning holy warriors without due cause. But papal pressure and political convenience prevailed. The arrest spread. In Paris, the Templar Grand Master Jacques de Molay was imprisoned. A veteran of the Crusades, a man of steel and faith, de Molay had believed the order was untouchable. Now he found himself chained and humiliated. He was interrogated for months, sometimes tortured, sometimes tempted with promises of pardon. He stood firm until, like so many others, he confessed under duress. Yet de Molay's spirit never fully broke. When summoned years later to publicly affirm his confession, he stunned the crowd. He recanted everything. Before stunned cardinals and royal envoys, he proclaimed the order's innocence and declared his own confession a lie. It was too late. The trials had dragged on for 7 years. The Pope, under immense pressure, issued a formal dissolution of the order in 1312. Not because they were proven guilty, but because their name had become too toxic to preserve. Justice had become a casualty of fear. Templar lands were confiscated. Some were given to the Hospitallers. Others were absorbed by the crown. The brotherhood was scattered. Some fled. Some joined other orders. Many faded into history, but Philip wanted a final act. A spectacle. An ending carved in fire. On March 18, 1314, Jacques de Molay, along with Templar leader Geoffroy de Charny, was led to a small island in the Seine River in Paris. Refusing to confess again, they were condemned as relapsed heretics. A stake was erected. Wood was piled high. The torch was lit. De Molay, as the flames licked his flesh, is said to have shouted a final curse, calling upon God to judge his persecutors. Pope Clement, King Philip, within the year, I summon you before the tribunal of heaven. By the year's end, both were dead. Whether prophecy or coincidence, the legend stuck. And from that fire, the myths were born of Templar revenge, hidden treasure, secret survival. But behind the legends lies a grim truth. The Templars were not betrayed by heretics or heathens. They were betrayed by Christendom itself. The fire that consumed Jacques de Molay on that cold March evening in 1314 did not merely devour a man. It marked the symbolic execution of an ideal, the final breath of an institution born in the Holy Land, baptized in blood, and buried in treachery. But fire is a strange thing. It destroys, but it also illuminates. And from the embers of the Templars' downfall, new shadows were cast, long, twisting, impossible to erase. In the immediate aftermath of the suppression, Europe stood still. For over 2 centuries, the Knights Templar had been ever present, on the battlefield, in the courts, in the economy, and in the soul of Christendom. Now they were gone. Not in a single blaze, but in a slow suffocation, dismantled by decree, divided by suspicion, and erased from the maps they once defended. Their castles were abandoned, reassigned, or left to decay. The Hospitallers absorbed some of their property, but the seamless machine the Templars had built, unified, disciplined, sacred, was gone. Their network had been snapped, their rule silenced, their archives sealed or destroyed. But memory is not so easily burned. Among the common folk, the Templars remained legends. Pilgrims still told stories of knights who had shielded them from bandits. Traders recalled the safety of their roads and strongholds. In the fields and taverns of France and Spain, ballads were whispered of betrayal and divine vengeance. The curse of de Molay was repeated with awe, its chilling accuracy lending it the aura of prophecy. And then came the rumors that some Templars had escaped, fleeing France under cover of night, that ships had left the port of La Rochelle, carrying gold, relics, or something more, that deep beneath crumbling fortresses, treasures remained buried, guarded by symbols, codes, and ghosts. No proof, only silence. But in that silence, myths bloomed. In Portugal, the Order of Christ emerged, a new brotherhood bearing striking resemblance to the Templars, sanctioned by the king, continuing their traditions. In Scotland, where papal influence was weak and royal enmity absent, tales spoke of Templars fighting alongside Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn, turning the tide of battle in exchange for sanctuary. Some whispered of a Templar fleet that reached the New World centuries before Columbus. Others linked them to the Freemasons, suggesting the ancient brotherhood had simply gone underground, preserving their secrets in symbols, stonework, and sacred geometry. Whether truth or fiction, these stories endured because they filled a void. The Templars had been more than soldiers, they were an idea. The idea that faith and discipline could forge something incorruptible. The idea that a man could devote himself not to wealth or fame, but to a cause higher than kings. The Church, despite its complicity, could not scrub away the guilt. Pope Clement V died a year after de Molay. King Philip IV followed soon after. A generation of monarchs watched nervously as the Templars' martyrdom became legend. Future popes hesitated before launching similar campaigns against other orders. But the damage had been done. A warning had been sent. No institution, no matter how holy, was safe from the ambitions of men. The intellectual legacy of the Templars also lived on. Their innovations in finance influenced emerging banking systems in Florence and Venice. Their architectural designs were studied and replicated. Their rule inspired later knightly orders, and their fall became a parable in law and politics. A cautionary tale about unchecked power and the cost of independence. Artists, poets, and chroniclers resurrected them again and again. In Renaissance paintings, the Templar stood as the tragic knight, valiant, misunderstood, noble to the end. In Gothic literature, they became mysterious figures haunting the margins of history. And in modern popular culture, they were transformed into everything from treasure keepers to shadowy conspirators. Their symbol, the red cross on white, became more than a military insignia. It became a canvas for dreams, fears, and fantasies. Yet beneath the layers of myth, one truth endures. The Templars were human. They laughed. They wept. They believed. They failed. They followed a code in a chaotic world, and that code brought them both glory and ruin. They were not perfect, but they were committed to each other, to their rule, and to a vision of Christendom that once seemed eternal. Their order was destroyed, but their legend was immortalized. And perhaps, in the end, that was their truest victory. Not in the lands they conquered, not in the gold they guarded, but in the story they left behind. A story etched into the soul of history, burning still, like an ember in the dark. In life, the Knights Templar were warriors of conviction, visible, armored, unflinching. But in death, they became something far more elusive, mystery incarnate. With the collapse of their order, the silence left behind did not bring closure. It invited questions, and from those questions grew legends, codes, and 1,000 secret histories written not in ink, but in symbols and suspicion. What were the Templars truly hiding? It is a question that echoes through cathedrals, across forgotten libraries, and deep within Masonic lodges. For while their wealth could be counted and their fortresses charted, their inner life, the rituals, the relics, the whispers, remains veiled in silence. We know this much. The Templars were bound by a secretive rule, one rarely shared outside their walls. Initiation ceremonies were conducted in closed chambers, under strict oaths, far from the gaze of even the Church. Recruits swore allegiance not to a king, but to the Grand Master and to God himself. They renounced all worldly ties, and in that vow, they became part of something larger than themselves, a spiritual army cloaked in earthly power. But what did those ceremonies contain? Torture-induced confessions claimed that recruits were made to spit on the cross, to deny Christ, to engage in heretical rites. These charges were used to dismantle the order, but historians now see them as fabrications, extracted through cruelty and desperation. Yet the secrecy itself cannot be denied. The Templars did perform rituals away from public view. They did speak in codes, use symbols, and maintain a rigid internal hierarchy. Their architecture, too, speaks in riddles. 8-sided chapels, spiral staircases, circular sanctuaries mirroring ancient holy sites. Was this mere formality, or something more? Among the most persistent legends is that the Templars discovered something beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem during their early years stationed there. For nearly a decade, They resided above the ruins of Solomon's temple, excavating beneath it in secret. No records remain of what they found, but afterward, their influence and wealth soared. Some claim they uncovered relics: the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, sacred scrolls, or forbidden gospels suppressed by the early church. Others suggest they stumbled upon knowledge, ancient geometry, lost rituals, or mystical traditions dating back to Egypt, Babylon, or even Atlantis. Wild theories, yes, but enduring ones. The order's sudden rise, their obsession with Jerusalem, and the strange symbology found in their seals and chapels have all fueled speculation. Twin pillars, the dome and the cube, the number 8, repeating in their sacred spaces. Some see Kabbalistic influence, others see pagan echoes veiled in Christian form. Then there are the Baphomet allegations. During the trials, several Templars confessed, again under torture, to worshipping a bearded idol named Baphomet. Descriptions varied. Some called it a head, others a cat. Some swore it spoke prophecies. Scholars today widely agree this was a myth weaponized by the French crown, a linguistic distortion of Muhammad, or Bathome, a corruption of Arabic or Greek words. Still, the imagery stuck, and centuries later, occultists would resurrect the name and give it new form. Freemasons, in particular, have long been linked to the Templar legacy. Though no direct historical line connects the two, symbolic parallels abound. Masonic lodges preserve rituals of secrecy, oaths of brotherhood, and architectural reverence drawn from the Temple of Solomon. The square and compass, the all-seeing eye, the concept of hidden knowledge passed from generation to generation. It is said that when the Templars were suppressed, some fled to Scotland, where they were sheltered by sympathetic clans and quietly integrated into guilds of stonemasons. From there, a lineage of esoteric knowledge, carried in cipher and stone, supposedly endured. Again, no proof, only echoes, and perhaps that is the essence of the Templar secret, not in a single object or scroll, but in the possibility. The possibility that truth lies hidden, just beyond reach. That beneath the ashes of the past smolders a fire of meaning we can still feel, even if we cannot name it. The true treasure of the Templars may never have been gold. It may have been memory, a collective memory of a time when men believed utterly in something greater than themselves. So fiercely that they built cathedrals, fought impossible wars, and died in chains rather than betray their brotherhood. That is the true mystery. That is the enduring secret of the temple. Not what they possessed, but what they inspired. Long after the flames consumed their bodies, long after their banners were lowered and their names defamed, the Templars still spoke through stone. Across Europe and the Holy Land, their legacy was carved into the very earth, written not in words, but in vaults and chapels, fortresses and doorways. The stones remain and they remember. To walk through a Templar site is to step into sacred geometry. Their architecture was never ornamental. It was symbolic, mathematical, reverent. The walls they built served not only to defend bodies but to elevate souls. Every line had purpose. Every proportion echoed ancient truths. At the heart of their architectural identity stood the round church, a design modeled after the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. While most churches of the time were cruciform, shaped like the cross, the Templars favored circular sanctuaries, symbolizing eternity, unity, and the heavens. One of the most iconic is the Temple Church in London, completed in the 1180s. Its circular nave, with austere pillars and a domed ceiling, creates an otherworldly sense of sacred space. There are no distractions, no gold leaf or stained glass, just symmetry, light, and silence. This was the Templar way. Throughout England, France, Spain, and Portugal, similar structures appear, often simple on the surface but hiding layers of meaning beneath. In Tomar, Portugal, the Convent of Christ remains a sprawling Templar masterpiece. Its inner sanctuary, an octagonal rotunda inspired by the Dome of the Rock, blends Eastern and Western elements in a harmony that reflects the order's dual identity. Christian warriors rooted in ancient soil. Geometry was sacred to the Templars. The octagon, in particular, appears frequently, bridging the square, earth, and the circle, heaven. 8 was also the number of resurrection and renewal. Many of their chapels and towers reflect this numerology, creating spiritual symmetry that went unnoticed by laypeople but shaped the atmosphere profoundly. Their castles were no less intentional. Built to defend and inspire, Templar fortresses like Croix de Chevaliers, Tortosa, and Château Pellerin were marvels of medieval engineering. Double curtain walls, moats hewn from rock, sloped bastions, hidden wells. They were designed not only to repel invaders but to withstand the siege of time. The positioning of their strongholds was equally deliberate. Many were erected on former pagan or Roman sites, locations long held to be sacred or strategic. The Templars did not erase the past. They repurposed it, absorbing older layers of sanctity into their own mission. It was as if they understood that power lingers in places where generations have prayed, bled, and dreamed. In France, the remnants of Templar commanderies can still be found in places like La Couvertoirade, where stone towers rise above sleepy villages, watching silently over time. In rural England, modest preceptories remain, their stones weathered, their inscriptions faint, but still intact. Even in ruins, the Templars' attention to harmony remains visible. Doorways align with solar angles. Courtyards mirror celestial patterns. Chapels face Jerusalem. This was not coincidence. It was a worldview made manifest. For the Templars, the physical and spiritual were never separate. A wall was not just a wall. It was a line of protection, a symbol of divine order. A circle was not just a shape, it was a mirror of heaven. Every castle was a cathedral, every chapel a fortress. This fusion of the martial and the mystical gave their buildings a quiet strength. Unlike the flamboyant Gothic cathedrals that soared skyward with stained glass bravado, Templar architecture spoke in whispers, solid, grounded, stoic, yet no less sacred, and their influence lingered. Later Gothic and Renaissance architects studied their designs. Masonic traditions traced their symbology. Even the modern fascination with sacred geometry, golden ratios, ley lines, harmonic architecture, owes something to the unseen hands of Templar masons. To this day, pilgrims seek out these ruins, these sanctuaries. Some come in reverence, others in curiosity, but all feel the hush that descends when entering these spaces. It is as though the stones themselves carry memory of chants once sung, of armor once clanking down narrow halls, of oaths once sworn in candlelit silence. What the sword could not protect, the stone has preserved. These are not just buildings. They are messages, sent across time. And if one listens, truly listens, those echoes still speak. Of all the stories that cling to the memory of the Knights Templar, none have captivated the imagination more than the bloodline myth. The idea that hidden within the order's rise and fall was a secret not of gold or relics, but of blood, royal blood. A line of descent so sacred, so heretical to church doctrine, that it had to be protected at all costs. This theory, more legend than history, begins not in battle or council chambers, but in whispers surrounding the Holy Grail. For centuries, the Grail had been understood as a sacred vessel, the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, said to have caught his blood at the crucifixion. But by the time of the Templars, that definition had begun to shift. In certain esoteric circles, especially among Gnostic Christians and Cathars, The Grail was seen not as an object, but as a metaphor for bloodline. The term sangreal, originally interpreted as sangreal, Holy Grail, was reimagined as sangreal, royal blood, and thus was born a radical idea that Jesus Christ had not only lived and died as man and God, but as husband and father, that he had wed Mary Magdalene, and together they had produced heirs, that this sacred bloodline had been preserved in secret, passed through generations, and eventually protected by an elite brotherhood, the Knights Templar. Mainstream history scoffs at this narrative, dismissing it as heretical fantasy. The Church has condemned it outright, but the myth persists, precisely because it challenges orthodoxy and because it fills the gaps left by the silence surrounding Templar rituals. Why, some ask, did the Templars excavate beneath the Temple Mount for 9 years without supervision or report? What did they find in the depths of ancient Jerusalem? Sacred relics? Scrolls? Or perhaps records, genealogies, confirming a truth long buried? Authors of popular conspiracy lore, from Holy Blood, Holy Grail to the Da Vinci Code, have woven elaborate narratives based on this possibility. They argue that the Templars became guardians of this bloodline, not only protecting the lineage itself but preserving its truth against the machinations of the Church, which feared its implications. For if Christ had earthly heirs, the divine authority of the papacy, founded on apostolic succession, would be undone. The faith would no longer rest solely on spiritual inheritance, but on biological descent. And that would shake Christendom to its core. Some claim that the Merovingian dynasty of early France, the same line the Templars later operated under, descended from this hidden bloodline. The Merovingians were famed for their long hair, mysterious rituals, and supposed mystical powers. Their eventual fall, it is said, was engineered by those who feared their true identity. The Templars, inheriting this sacred trust, were tasked with preserving both the bloodline and its associated relics, perhaps even the Grail itself, if understood as a physical symbol of divine royalty. Supporters of the theory point to Templar iconography. Twin knights on a single horse, representing duality, spiritual and blood. The recurring use of Magdalene imagery in remote chapels. The octagonal architecture symbolizing resurrection and regeneration. The secrecy, the silence, the ferocity with which they guarded knowledge no one else was allowed to see. Even the violent suppression of the order is seen in this light, not as a punishment for heresy, but a calculated attempt to erase dangerous knowledge. The Templars, in this telling, were not merely victims of royal greed, but of a theological war over truth itself. Did they succeed in preserving it? Some say yes, that descendants of the bloodline still live, hidden, protected by secret societies that evolved from the Templar remnants. That their legacy has survived through the Priory of Chaon, the Freemasons, or even obscure royal houses in exile. Others believe the knowledge alone endures, hidden in coded manuscripts, etched into the stone of cathedrals, waiting to be decoded. But most historians view the bloodline myth as allegory, an expression of humanity's hunger for divine continuity and rebellion against religious authoritarianism. A romantic idea, perhaps, that the divine could walk among us, not as spirit or symbol, but as flesh and kin. Regardless of its truth, the myth has power. It reflects what the Templars became after their fall. A mirror, a vessel, into which we pour our deepest fears and highest hopes, about faith, power, truth, and the price of secrets. The bloodline myth is not just about a child of Christ. It is about the possibility that truth was buried, guarded, and nearly lost, and that somewhere, perhaps still, someone carries the key not to gold or glory, but to understanding the sacred in a new way. And in that myth, the Templars live on, not just as knights, but as keepers of something that could never be allowed to see the light. The flames danced against the evening sky. Paris stood silent, the crowd stunned not by the crackle of burning flesh, but by the voice that rose defiantly from within the fire. Bound in chains, his beard smoldering, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, did not plead. He did not scream. He cursed. Pope Clement, King Philip, before the year is out, I summon you to the judgment of God. Those who witnessed it would speak of it in hushed tones for years. It was not merely the final breath of a condemned man. It was a proclamation, prophecy, a warning. At the time, it must have seemed like bluster from a broken soul. A man betrayed, tortured, and burned alive. But what came next would embed his words in legend. Within a month, Pope Clement V was dead. Stricken with illness, bedridden and gasping for breath. The man who had dissolved the order with a papal bull now dissolved into dust. The Vatican entered a crisis, and the papacy, once unquestioned, was stained by suspicion. Within 7 months, King Philip IV himself was dead, felled by a stroke during a hunting expedition. The monarch who had orchestrated the Templars' arrest, who had burned their leaders and seized their gold, fell into the earth with no time for repentance. And within a few short years, all of Philip's sons, his heirs to the Capetian dynasty, would die mysteriously or without male issue, ending one of the most powerful royal lines in French history. France was plunged into turmoil. The 100 Years' War loomed on the horizon, and the land that had once silenced the Templars now echoed with blood and betrayal. Coincidence? Divine retribution? Or the final justice of a dying brotherhood? To the people of the time, there was no doubt. The Templar curse had worked. It became a whispered tale in taverns, a warning in courts, a subject of terrified fascination. Priests dared not speak of it openly. Nobles who had profited from the Templars' demise grew nervous. Even those who had mocked the order began to wonder, had the Grand Master invoked something more powerful than the sword? The story traveled far. In England, Spain, and the German states, the tale of de Molay's curse was repeated like scripture. His final words became part of the order's mythology. Some said he had invoked the Archangel Michael. Others claimed he had called on Christ himself to avenge him. Some even suggested he'd used an ancient formula passed down from Solomon's temple. Words that burned brighter than fire. As centuries passed, the story evolved. French chroniclers later added details, claiming the Templar pyre refused to burn until his curse was spoken. Others said the flames flared unnaturally high as he raised his voice. Artists painted the scene with surreal fury. The Grand Master defiant amid a storm of embers, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if seeing beyond the veil. The curse also spawned new fears, that the Templars had not truly died, that their spirit, vengeful, righteous, and betrayed, still lingered in the shadows of France, watching, waiting, that their secret networks, their lost treasure, their divine oath had outlived their bodies. Centuries later, the French Revolution would rekindle these myths. As the French monarchy fell, and King Louis XVI was executed in 1793, some claim a mysterious voice from the crowd shouted, "Jacques de Molay, you are avenged." There is no record of who spoke it, no certainty it was said at all. But like all things connected to the Templars, it does not need proof to endure. The idea of the curse transcended time. It became a symbol of divine justice, of silent retribution, of the notion that betrayal, especially betrayal cloaked in holiness, would never go unpunished. For those who still revere the Templars, the curse is not a myth. It is a testament to loyalty unbroken, to vengeance long awaited, to the final words of a man who refused to kneel, even to death. The fire consumed his flesh, but his voice, his curse, burns on. When the royal forces of King Philip IV stormed the Templar commanderies on that infamous October morning in 1307, they expected to seize a fortune, one that would fund wars, pay debts, and replenish the hollow coffers of the French crown. But when they broke through the doors of the Paris Temple, when they pried open the iron-bound vaults, what they found was nothing. No gold, no jewels, no sacred relics, no scrolls of arcane power. The treasure was gone, and with it began one of the most enduring legends of the medieval world. A mystery that has haunted historians, treasure hunters, and conspiracy theorists for centuries. What happened to the Templar treasure? Because there is no doubt they had one. For nearly 2 centuries, the Knights Templar had accumulated vast wealth through donations, rents, tithes, and commerce. They managed estates in every corner of Europe. They served as bankers to kings and popes. Their network was global. Their vaults, especially in Paris, were known to be full of coin, documents, and holy relics. So how did it all disappear? Some say it was moved days before the arrests. Whispers tell of 24 carts that left the Paris temple under cover of darkness, guarded by trusted brothers, vanishing into the night. Their destination? Unknown. But their mission? Clear: to hide the treasure before it fell into unworthy hands. Others claim it had already been relocated years earlier, split among remote Templar commanderies in Scotland, Portugal, or Cyprus, hidden in deep wells, beneath altars, or in mountainside caves known only to the highest ranks of the order. There are even tales of ships waiting in the port of La Rochelle, ready to sail the treasure far from French shores. Some believe those ships crossed the seas, perhaps to England, perhaps to the Mediterranean, perhaps even across the Atlantic. Could it have reached the New World centuries before Columbus? Some argue that certain stone carvings and mysterious symbols in Nova Scotia, particularly at the infamous Oak Island, suggest the presence of European visitors long before official history allows. Among the many theories surrounding the so-called money pit, the Templar treasure stands at the top, fueled by tales of encrypted codes, booby traps, and sealed chambers far beneath the earth. Skeptics dismiss these ideas as fantasy. But the truth remains. The treasure vanished, and it was never found. Yet not all treasure glitters. Templar documents and archives, too, disappeared. The sudden loss of written records, a paper trail that had once managed estates, mapped safe houses, and recorded oaths, suggests something far more deliberate than a simple robbery or seizure. Some historians believe the Templars had a contingency plan, that they anticipated betrayal. The structure of their order, cellular, disciplined, fanatically loyal, may have allowed them to disperse their wealth without a trace. Grand Master Jacques de Molay himself was in Paris just before the arrests. Did he authorize the removal? Was it already underway? What of the holy relics the Templars were said to protect? Legends say they held not just sacred objects from Christendom, but artifacts from Solomon's temple. Perhaps even the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, or long-lost Gnostic Gospels suppressed by Rome. In the absence of evidence, myth becomes magnet. Treasure hunters have scoured the hills of Rennes-le-Château, the depths of Rosslyn Chapel, and the sands of the Holy Land, each place rumored to house a piece of the vanished hoard. And the mystique only grows, because the treasure, whether physical, spiritual, or symbolic, represents more than gold. It represents freedom, the ability to move outside the grip of kings, the power to survive persecution, the means to preserve truth. What if the treasure wasn't intended to be found? What if it was scattered, sealed, encrypted, not to enrich but to protect? To ensure that, should the world one day fall into darkness, the flame of ancient knowledge could be reignited. Some believe it's still out there, hidden in plain sight, awaiting the right hands. Others believe it was taken to the grave with the last faithful knights, their lips sealed by vow and fire. But the question lingers. And perhaps that is the greatest treasure of all. Not the gold, but the mystery. Because as long as it remains unsolved, the Templars are never truly gone. They remain just beyond the horizon, just beneath the stone, waiting. The flames that consumed the Templar Grand Master in 1314 were meant to mark an ending. A final exclamation of power by a monarch and a pope. A warning to all who would resist authority. But history has a curious way of defying endings. For though the order of the Knights Templar was erased by parchment and pyre, its spirit lived on, scattered, reshaped, whispered into the fabric of European history. It began with survival. Not all Templars perished in the purge. Many who escaped France fled east or south, seeking sanctuary in places where the papal grip was weaker. Some found refuge in Scotland, a land embroiled in rebellion and distant from Rome's immediate reach. There, according to legend, Templar knights were welcomed by Robert the Bruce, who had been excommunicated by the Pope himself. In return, it is said, the Templars fought alongside Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn, their discipline helping secure an unexpected Scottish victory. Whether true or not, this tale took root, and with it, the idea that the Templars had become invisible, no longer an order by name, but a brotherhood in silence. In Portugal, their survival was more concrete. King Denis, a ruler both devout and pragmatic, refused to persecute the Templars. Instead, in 1319, he simply renamed them, forming the Order of Christ, which absorbed the Templars' assets and members but under a new banner. The papacy, seeking peace, approved it. Through this loophole, the Templars continued, not in defiance but in transformation. This Order of Christ would later play a critical role in the Age of Exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator, a key figure in Portugal's maritime expansion, was its Grand Master. Ships bearing the Red Cross, once sewn on tunics of Templar knights, now sailed into the unknown, carrying the spirit of crusade into uncharted oceans. The sword had become the compass. Elsewhere, the Templar myth seeped into guilds, societies, and secret brotherhoods. Over the centuries, Freemasonry emerged in Europe, claiming to inherit the esoteric knowledge of the Templars. Though there is no direct historical link, the Masonic structure, its rituals, hierarchies, and symbols, echoed those of the Knights. The twin pillars, the sacred geometry, the emphasis on moral code, hidden wisdom, and architectural allegory, all spoke to a lineage deeper than stone. In Masonic lore, the Templars were not martyrs, they were guardians. Their fall was not defeat, it was concealment. And their wisdom was not lost. It was hidden, encoded in stone and ceremony, passed from one generation to the next through veiled initiations. By the 18th century, entire Masonic degrees were dedicated to the Templar legacy. Titles like Knight of the Temple and Knight Kadosh symbolically linked the initiates to a brotherhood that had never truly died. At the same time, Europe was gripped by Romanticism, and the Templars became subjects of poetry, opera, and political symbolism. Revolutionary movements, such as those during the French Revolution, adopted Templar imagery to signify resistance against corruption and tyranny. The Red Cross, once a symbol of crusade, now became an emblem of secret liberty. In modern times, numerous organizations claiming Templar heritage have arisen, some spiritual, some charitable, some purely ceremonial. Though none can prove a direct line to the original knights, they all draw from the same well of inspiration. Honor, sacrifice, loyalty, and the eternal struggle between truth and power. Even the Vatican, centuries later, would reevaluate the past. In 2007, the Chinon parchment, a once-lost document, was rediscovered in the Vatican secret archives. It revealed that Pope Clement V had absolved the Templars of heresy during the trials, acknowledging their faith and orthodoxy. The The suppression of the order, it seemed, had been political, not spiritual. It was a quiet vindication 7 centuries too late. But vindication nonetheless. Today, the Templars exist not in armor but in memory, in stories passed down, in architecture preserved, in symbols etched into ancient chapels and modern dreams. They have become something more than knights. They have become a mythos, a living echo. And in every group that holds secret meetings under candlelight, in every movement that seeks truth against overwhelming odds, in every soul that fights for something higher than themselves, the Templar flame flickers still. They may have fallen by sword and fire, but they rose again, reborn in brotherhood. Centuries after their dramatic fall, the Knights Templar are more present than ever, not on horseback or in armor, but across the pages of novels, the glow of cinema screens, the pixels of video games, and the shadows of conspiracy theories. In modern imagination, the Templars are everywhere, shape-shifting between holy warriors, secret societies, and keepers of forbidden knowledge. Their journey from medieval battlefield to cultural icon is nothing short of extraordinary. It began with Romanticism. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European writers and artists, fascinated by chivalry, secrecy, and martyrdom, revived the image of the Templar as a tragic hero. The poet Lord Byron evoked them in his verses. Writers like Sir Walter Scott, in Ivanhoe, depicted Templar knights as both noble and flawed, mixing historical depth with fictional flair. By the time cinema arrived, the Templars were ripe for adaptation. In early films, they appeared as stoic defenders of Christendom, guardians of lost relics, or misunderstood mystics. But it was the 1980s and beyond that would elevate them to pop culture immortality. In Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the quest for the Holy Grail was inextricably tied to the Templars, immortal guardians of divine relics. National Treasure wove them into America's founding myths, suggesting they had passed their secrets through the Freemasons and left hidden clues beneath colonial cities. The Dan Brown phenomenon exploded with the Da Vinci Code. Though historically loose, it ignited public fascination by linking the Templars to Mary Magdalene, the Holy Grail, and a hidden bloodline of Christ. Overnight, millions were debating the Templars' role in the Church, questioning what had really happened in the shadows of history. Bookstores filled with speculative histories. Documentaries flourished. Tourism surged to Templar sites. In video games, particularly in the Assassin's Creed franchise, the Templars are reimagined as a powerful, secretive organization locked in an eternal struggle with free-thinking assassins. The games turned their iconography, white mantles, red crosses, black secrets, into digital mythos. While fictional, they preserved an emotional truth. The Templars remain compelling because they represent order versus freedom, faith versus control. Even in heavy metal music, television shows like Nightfall, fantasy series like Game of Thrones, and anime, echoes of the Templars' aesthetic and ideals resonate. Knights in white with grim duty, torn between devotion and doubt. But why? What is it about the Templars that grips us still? Perhaps it's because they were both real and unknowable men of discipline who lived by a code, yet who wrapped themselves in secrecy. Perhaps because they died not on the battlefield, but in betrayal, making them martyrs to principle in a cynical world. Or perhaps because, in an age of information overload and eroded trust, the idea of a forgotten truth buried by time feels more real than fiction. They are a vessel for our fears and fascinations. To some, they are heroes, symbols of courage, sacrifice, and honor in a fractured world. To others, they are villains, fanatics cloaked in righteousness, tools of empire and control. To most, they are a mystery, and that is their power. Their image has become almost archetypal. The silent knight, the secret map, the ancient vault, the red cross on a white shield. A few simple visuals, yet endlessly adaptable. Whether in fiction or fashion, the Templar look is instantly recognizable, evocative of something larger than life. And yet, In the midst of all the myth and market, their human truth risks being forgotten. They were men, sworn to God, drawn to war, bound by oaths. They struggled with fear, ambition, and faith. They died not knowing they would be remembered. They did not write the legends that now bear their name. We did, and in doing so we have made them immortal. As long as we continue to seek mystery in our world, to imagine secret orders and lost knowledge, the Knights Templar will ride again. This time, not across the desert, but through our stories, our dreams, and the symbols we still carve into our collective memory. The last Templar may have perished in fire centuries ago, but the legacy of the order did not vanish with him. In many ways, it has grown louder with time, less a whisper from the past, and more a resonant chord playing through the architecture of our modern world. The Knights Templar, born as warrior monks during the Crusades, have become far more than a medieval footnote. They are myth, memory, and mirror reflecting who we were, who we are, and who we might become. Today, the Templar legacy lives on in places, symbols, institutions, and ideals. Across Europe and the Middle East, their fortresses still stand, weathered by centuries but unbowed. Places like Tomar, La Couvertoirade, Temple Church, and Croix de Chevaliers remain living relics, drawing pilgrims, tourists, and seekers of truth. Each stone bears witness. Each chapel holds silence. Each wall reminds us that once, men stood here believing in something eternal. In cities around the world, the Red Cross endures, not only on flags and shields, but on humanitarian banners, where it symbolizes healing, neutrality, and global aid. The Knights Hospitaller, cousins of the Templars, evolved into what is now the Order of Malta, still active in global charity today. The notion of a knightly order serving not kings but causes lives on through such organizations. In the realm of religion and ritual, the Templar rule continues to influence the codes of other Christian knightly and lay orders. The discipline, silence, charity, and humility once demanded by the Templar rule still echo in the vows of monks, priests, and modern spiritual seekers striving for a life of meaning beyond material wealth. In politics, their story remains a warning. The collusion between king and pope that crushed the order is studied not just as historical drama, but as a lesson in the dangers of unchecked authority, the manipulation of public fear, and the fragility of justice when truth is inconvenient. The Templars are invoked by modern libertarians, constitutional scholars, and civil rights defenders as a symbol of power restrained by principle. In the shadowy world of secret societies, the Templars remain a beacon, both revered and reinvented. The Freemasons, with their cryptic rituals and architecture, draw symbolic lineage from the Knights. Countless Templar-inspired orders, both legitimate and fringe, have emerged, some focused on spirituality, others on ceremony, a few obsessed with conspiracy. But the truest survival of the Templar legacy is not in buildings or ceremonies. It is in story. For centuries, the Templars have given voice to humanity's longing for purity in a corrupt world. They represent the idea that faith can walk alongside discipline, that sacrifice has meaning, and that truth, even when buried, always seeks the light. In modern culture, from best-selling novels to blockbuster films, the Templars are not just historical figures, they are symbols of lost knowledge, of loyalty against impossible odds, of betrayal, resilience, and rebirth. And in a world overwhelmed by noise, many still yearn for what the Templars once embodied: order, meaning, and silence in the service of something greater. Schools teach of their military might. Philosophers ponder their moral paradoxes. Artists reinterpret their symbols. And ordinary people, pilgrims of the modern age, still walk the paths they once rode, searching not for treasure, but for understanding. What, then, is the true Templar legacy? It is not gold, nor relics, nor political power. It is the idea that even in the most violent of times, honor can survive. That brotherhood, forged in sacred purpose, can outlive empires. That stories matter. That myths are not lies, but truths too deep to be spoken plainly. The Knights Templar began as guardians of pilgrims and died as martyrs of politics. Yet their afterlife is the most astonishing of all. They endure not as ghosts but as archetypes. And so long as we seek the sacred in a fallen world, so long as we yearn for meaning in the face of chaos, the Red Cross will not fade. It will burn on in hearts, in legends, and in the silent places where faith and fire still meet.